Hi guys, welcome back to my channel here. In today's session, we're gonna build up on my last video where we're looking in how to effectively describe your actions and how to describe the input fields in there. And today we are building up on that and looking more into getting a human in the loop. So we are asking users for approval before executing it to let the user validate what is actually going into his request, and how we can also refine the output which we are getting from an action and how we are responding back to the user. If you want to make your actions even more clear for the users and to behave the way you want them to behave, then stay tuned and let's dive into that. In today's video, we are picking up the event finder from last week. If you have questions about which Power Automate flows behind there, how the system prompt looks, etc., I will link up the video somewhere here on top, and you can check that before going to this one. However, in today's session, we're gonna focus on how to further fine-tune our tools, for example, to get an approval from a user, and also to refine the response which we are getting. So we have actually three different inputs which we have in there: city, start date, end date, and you might want to have a user to validate those first before they are actually going to the API and making the API call. So therefore, you have an option here under additional details. Ask the end user before running. In that case, it's currently selected on no. But in our case, we want to get the validation from the user first to see if the data is correctly going into the API and if the user actually wants to execute that API. In that example, think about an API which is incurring cost. Not all of the APIs which are out there are free of use. So you might want to inform a user, hey, if you're using this specific API call, you are incurring costs. For example, 2-3 euro for each call. So a user will actually think about making these specific calls. So therefore, we are selecting yes here, and we can choose now basically between two different options here. We can send a specific response, or we can build in adaptive carding here. Therefore, let's choose send a specific response, and let's start with a very simple message. For example, this API is incurring costs. Are you sure you want to proceed? And if we now save this, and then we can basically test our action and see how it behaves in that case. Let's wait until this is saved. And now it's successfully saved. So let's refresh this one. And we can ask in our case, what are the events on 13/6/2025 in Amsterdam? What will happen now is it will trigger again the tool, but instead of directly running it, so we can see in the background, it already mapped the specific fields. It's asking if we actually want to proceed. So when we're typing yes now, only then it's starting to trigger the call and basically get the response and getting back with an answer to us. So that way we can, for example, for costly API, we can ensure that there's a validation before it runs. However, that's not the only use case. Another use case could be that you have a lot of input fields and you want to make sure that they are correctly mapped and a user can validate that before that. So let's check out how you can do that. Therefore, we're going back into Tools section. We're going back to our additional details, and we're gonna change this message a bit here. We can just remove the part and say, we want to execute API call with the following details. And we have, in that case, 3 input fields. So let's make this as a list, for example. We have the city, we have the start date, and we have the end date. Then you would make a message. Are you sure you want to execute this API call. And the user can respond on it. However, now you haven't mapped yet the input which we're incoming into that message. You can do this by using a PowerFX formula. And you can see already here now, it's taking the topic input.text, input.text1, and input.text2. So now you might wonder yourself, okay, which one is .text, which one is text.1, which is text.2. There's one way to find that out. You can go on top here to the code view, and here you can see the description with the property name. So in this case, we have the text, that's city, we have text1, which is start date, and we have text2, which is end date. If you're unsure which property is which one, just go back to the YAML file and double check. Let's start with the city. We can insert a variable here, will be our text. We're gonna have start date, and we're gonna have an end date. So now that we have mapped all of our fields, we can save our changes again. We can reuse the same prompt like we did before, but let's see how that message has changed now. So now that we have executed the prompt, we can now see that it's filling out the data and it's basically presenting the user with, hey, these are the fields which I have mapped now. Are these the correct fields? Because just imagine you have 10 fields sometimes, and then I have difficulties mapping these fields specifically. So in that case, it can be a very valid case to basically let a user validate it before it's actually being executed and to have the human in the loop for validation here. So also here, we can say yes again, and it's gonna execute that API call again only after we gave our approval for that. So that's a very simple scenario to just let a user validate which is going in there, either for cost matters or to make sure that the right data is going into your APIs. Approval for the user, we can also ensure that our output will always look the same. You might have seen that this from time to time changes. So there's the possibility to either control this via the system prompt directly, or to also work with the completion in the tool. You're going back to tools, you have at the section here, you have a completion. And in that case, we can even say, hey, we don't want to respond. We can say rewrite the response with generative AI. We can also say send a specific response or send an adaptive card. And in the advanced section here, we can also see the response, which is coming back from the output. And also here, you can also see again, you can even concatenate this specific output if you have multiple outputs. However, in our case, we have only one response. So you can back here on the steering wheel and can basically help also with a description to tell the agent what it will receive back. You can not only tell it what it can receive back. So you could, for example, provide a JSON, or you just tell it, hey, you receive a JSON back. You can also tell it how it basically interprets that output and responds with that. So let's take a description like the following. You are receiving a JSON output. Make sure to interpret it always in the following output. So we want event name with height and hex, type, time, and the value. And very important is then if you have at the top here selected don't respond, it's not gonna pick up this description, and it will only work with the system prompt, which is defined in the back. You need to switch this setting here to write the response with generative AI. Once you save that, let's re-execute our action and let's see how it will change the output from having links and images to a much simpler layout, which we just defined. For example, what are the events in Amsterdam on the 36, 2025? We're going to be asked for approval again, which we set up. So we can answer that with yes. And we're going to receive back our response from the action again. And now we can see here, it's basically strictly holding itself to the description output, which we just defined. with that specific one. So if you basically need to ensure that you're always getting the same output back, it's better to define it in your response description to make sure that it's following always the same setup or format basically. These are currently the most important settings which you should set up when configuring your actions and you want to follow it. Certain formats, that it's picking up the inputs correctly, and to also give the user a valid output. There's much more to discover around tools, for example. You can work with adaptive cards inside that. You can also work with hard-coded outputs. That's up to you. However, I think this will give you the good tool set to configure your Copilot with the right tools and getting a good user experience out of that. So thank you for watching, and I'm going to see you next time. Bye, guys.